All right, Chapter 9 looks at principles of infectious disease and epidemiology. This chapter is full of terminology. All right, infectious disease is disease caused by microorganisms that are allowed to pass from one person to another. And naturally, then, we're going to deal with a fair number of terms. So, throughout the chapter, we're going to see different terms looking at opportunistic versus true pathogen, communicable versus non-communicable disease, how is it transferred from one person to the next, acute disease versus chronic, endemic versus sporadic disease. And while these terms may not make sense right now, once you get to the chapter, you should be able to easily compare and contrast those terms with each other. All right, and looking at the list of objectives, you have 12 here, and if we move to the next slide, there are another 6 to make a total of 18. Some of these objectives are straightforward in terms of know the term that's in it. So 13 there, define the terms population, morbidity, and mortality. Some of the objectives look more at understanding of a particular concept. But overall, the material is not excessive. So first off, basic for this term or for this chapter is infectious disease, an illness caused by a pathogen, so a microorganism, and then epidemiology. Epidemiology is the monitoring and controlling disease occurrence to promote public health. And the NIH, the National Institute for Health, has a huge part of it that is working with epidemiology. And so if you hear of certain outbreaks, especially with the Ebola outbreak several years ago, you hear about the CDC sending people out there, and people from epidemiology departments, public health departments, state health departments, they're out there monitoring disease, making sure that it is under control. All right, so with the pathogens, all right, any microorganism can be a pathogen. And in Table 9.1, we see the different groups of pathogens. The helminths, those are the parasitic worms. Protozoan, animal-like protists, all right, those are eukaryotic. And then fungi, bacteria, viruses, and prions. We've looked at all of these at some degree already. All right, with the disease terminology, many of these terms match up with the Sarago assignment for this chapter. All right, if a pathogen is opportunistic, it's only going to cause disease when the host is weakened. So if a person is completely healthy and immunocompetent, meaning their immune system is working properly, then they're not going to get sick. Some fungal organisms, or let's stick with fungal organisms. If you expose a healthy, immunocompetent person to a fungus, and then expose the same pathogen to a person with HIV or AIDS, that person with HIV or AIDS has a weakened immune system. They are not immunocompetent, and so they are most likely going to come down with that fungal infection. All right, so that fungus in that case is an opportunistic pathogen. A true pathogen does not require the host to be weakened in their immune system and can cause the disease in any circumstance. So that would be like Ebola. All right, you expose someone to Ebola, give them a direct inoculant with the virus, and they're going to get sick. It doesn't matter what their immune system is like, they're going to get sick. Now, they may not succumb to the disease if they were immunocompetent. Their immune system might be strong enough to fight it. Their overall health might help them fight the disease, the infection. But it's still going to cause disease. All right, sporadic cases are diseases that are isolated infections in a particular population, such as Ebola. Endemic are infections that are routinely detected in a population or region, so head colds, those type of things that are really always in the population. Epidemic is widespread disease, outbreak in a particular region during a specific time. So there was the measles outbreak in the state of Washington. Right? In those particular counties, that was epidemic in nature at that point, and it spread into Oregon, and it spread into other counties within Washington. Pandemic occurs if the epidemic spreads to numerous countries. So thankfully we don't see this too often, but we can see it with certain influenza strains, as well as other, probably primarily viral infections. Emerging pathogens are generally those that are found in the population or have come into the human population in the last 40 years, between 30 and 40 years, depending on what source you look at. Re-emerging pathogens are those that were once thought to be under control, but now are resurfacing and becoming a problem. And the example given here are antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And then also viral infections can also be within this group, especially if individuals do not get vaccinated and then the virus comes back into the population. And zoonotic diseases are those spread from animals to humans. And there's several of those. Rabies is probably the most well-known zoonotic disease. But even influenza can be zoonotic. It can be passed from an animal, a duck or a pig, into humans, even though it's also communicable, meaning it can get passed from person to person. Diseases that are non-communicable do not spread from person to person. Alright, so I just mentioned the communicable. Contagious diseases are easily transmitted from one host to the next. Alright, how contagious is a disease? Do you need to stay in isolation? Do you need to wear a mask if you go out into public when you have a particular disease? This is, an example would be influenza. Alright, influenza, if you're at the height of your disease, it could actually be quite contagious. And so you do want to wear a mask if you go out into public. You can have different symptoms. Alright, signs and symptoms. If you are symptomatic in the disease, you are having signs and symptoms. And signs are objective indicators that can be measured or verified, and primarily those are thought to be verified by a physician or medical personnel. So is there fever, rash, blood in the stool? Some of those you as a patient might be able to identify, but some cases you need the medical personnel to quantitate that. All right, and then symptoms are sensed by the patient and are subjective. All right, so pain. What's your scale of pain from 1 to 10? All right, are you tired? Are you more tired than normal? Are you nauseated? Those are things that can't be precisely measured, all right, and are based on the patient. Patients experience a latent infection are usually asymptomatic, where the virus, primarily virus, has gone into hiding and isn't actively causing disease. And then acute disease are those that have a rapid onset and progression. All right, if you get the influenza, all right, typically you feel lousy, all right, you feel fine. The next day you kind of feel lousy. By the end of the day, you are sick, all right, a rapid onset there. If it's chronic, then there's usually a slower onset and progression. the progression is much slower, takes a long time, and your body is generally able to work in the process of adapting to the disease scenario. All right, with Koch's postulates, we're going to look at this in class, and this is a famous set of rules that look at how to identify infectious disease, but we'll look at this in lab, and we'll also look at the limitations of Koch's postulates. And then pathogens come from different sources, some of which are reservoirs. Reservoirs are going to be where the disease just kind of hangs out, right? Whether that is an animal, whether that is a water source of some sort, an inanimate habitat out in the environment somewhere. And then sources can be endogenous, meaning the pathogen comes from its own body, or exogenous, coming from an external source. So with the endogenous source, a lot of times when individuals develop urinary tract infections, right, often those are caused by E. coli, and E. coli is a major inhabitant of our intestinal tract. And probably more, in many cases, if a person comes down with a urinary tract infection, it's actually bacteria that has made its way from the GI tract to the urinary tract, and that's an endogenous source. Exogenous source, did you get a puncture wound or some major flesh wound, and the pathogen got into your tissue through that wound or that injury, and then you ended up having an infection at that point. All right, so here's some examples. The exogenous sources: contaminated food, medical equipment, soil, water. Animals, those are the zoonotic diseases, and humans, all right, also transmit communicable infections from one person to another. Endogenous sources, I mentioned the misplaced normal microbiota, and then also disrupted microbiota or opportunistic pathogens. So an example here is the yeast in the vagina that might proliferate and cause infection after you take antibiotics that kill off all the bacterial neighbors, and then there's more room for the yeast to grow and expand. And I think this is where we will stop this part.